and she developed more research in this area and went on to develop a new model, actually helping us think about cross-cultural communication, but particularly in the area of phenomena, really, of breaking bad news. And Sophie's going to talk to us about her research and that. Sophie is now a registrar haematologist, and I think will be completing her training in the near future. And we're delighted to have you here today, Sophie. And with your permission, we will record the session. And I think Mary will make it available for you later if you want to put it on your own personal website. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, and welcome everyone to this presentation on concealing cancer diagnoses, a cultural dilemma. As Jan explained, my name's Sophie Holmes. I am a registrar in clinical haematology. I'm based in Bristol, but this work was done while I was undertaking a Master's in Medical Education at Newcastle University, supervised by Jan Illing. In 2016, I worked at Newcastle University's campus in Malaysia, NUMed. I was a clinical teaching fellow. This campus delivers the UK curriculum in a Malaysian context, so identical curriculum, teaching and assessment, but all clinical experience in hospitals in Malaysia. While I was working there, I noticed a number of differences in interpersonal dynamics and the doctor-patient relationship, but the one that really stood out to me was the attitude and the approach to breaking bad news. And this is where the project began. I focused specifically on concealing cancer diagnoses, but as Jan has highlighted, this is an issue that spans across any kind of serious problem. And I'd be interested to see what our audience thinks. So have a think to yourself of a vote on these three options. So do you think A, that patients should always be told that they have a serious or a cancer diagnosis, or B, that they should never be told that they have a cancer diagnosis, or C, it depends on the situation? And so if you've sort of got these two options, usually in an audience with our cultural positioning, we would go towards the lines of patients should always be told that they have cancer or that they have a serious problem. But internationally, practice is very varied. So in a relatively recent survey in Greece, it was found that 90% of doctors would not reveal a new cancer diagnosis to a patient. And in China, 62% of patients do not know that they have cancer before starting chemotherapy. Going on, why is this happening? And the first thing to say is that it's really rooted in compassion. The practice of concealing diagnoses originates when the patient's family requests that the diagnosis be concealed. This is because they have a worry that if the patient knows they have cancer or a serious illness, they're going to be distressed psychologically, they're going to not engage with treatment, and they're going to have worse outcomes as a result. However, we know that patients, when given the choice, want to know the reality of their situation, and this has been demonstrated across cultures. Surveys in Nigeria and China have shown that when patients have the option, they want to know. A further issue is that concealing diagnoses doesn't work. Eventually, the diagnosis comes to light, usually under a less than ideal circumstance, for example, at night from a doctor covering emergencies, as opposed to a planned, peaceful, supported breaking bad news experience with specialist nurses and consultants on hand. And the practice of hiding diagnoses causes problems. Patients that know what's going on with them do better. They do better physically and psychologically, and they feel connected to their families and their practitioners. With all of these problems, why are we not telling patients that they have cancer? What is happening that's stopping this reality from being conveyed? And of course, it is crucial that we offer the patient the opportunity not to hear the diagnosis, and that is an essential step and really needs to be embedded in our strategy for breaking bad news. And perhaps in the UK, isn't quite that opportunity isn't quite taken as much as it could be, and sometimes patients are told the diagnosis without being given that option not to hear it. However, there are barriers that are stopping bad news from being broken when it would be really helpful and when the patient would want it. And so overcoming these barriers is a challenge for globalised medical education, both to sort of find a way through it and also to avoid cultural imperialism. To look into these questions, we did 2 studies. One of them was a survey of medical students in Malaysia and UK looking at variation in attitudes to the phenomenon. And the second study was qualitative, using phenomenology to dig into clinicians' lived experience. It's looked at medical students in Malaysia and the UK and international medical graduates now working in the northeast of England. Starting with the survey. So this one was looking at cultural variation attitudes to communication and end-of-life care. Was to determine differences. The phenomenon of concealing serious diagnoses gets called different things in different parts of the world. So in Spain, it's called the Silence Pact, and in Malaysia, it's called collusion. So that's a recognised term to a Malaysian audience. And so for our students, we had these several questions. Do they believe it's right? What do they perceive to be the cultural norm? And how do they expect to navigate this area in practice? We used a paper questionnaire survey. There were statements related to collusion with a 5-point scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. It was given to final year medical students. We had high response rates at both cohorts in Malaysia and the UK, and it was a good number of students overall. They were done in 2017 and 2018. What did we find? So across both cohorts, students agreed that collusion is not in the best interest of the patient. They felt that patients should have the right to decide whether or not they're told a diagnosis. And they agreed that most patients want to know the truth. So far, unsurprising, uncontroversial, these 2 cohorts have received a UK curriculum. However, their observations in practice were very different. The students in Malaysia had observed that relatives were told a diagnosis before the patient, and this was a really stark difference. 64% of students in Malaysia, 2% in the UK. Secondly, there was a difference in terms of how far they would go against the principles of patient empowerment, informed consent, if asked to do so by their consultant. The majority of Malaysian students would go along with that request. Students at both sites were left facing a challenge. They felt unprepared to respond to requests for collusion from patients' families. And they also recognised that collusion was more likely to occur when doctors are not confident in their communication skills. There were 2 pain points that emerged from this survey. One was that for students in Malaysia, there was conflict between their personal beliefs, formal training, and cultural expectations. And at both sites, students did not feel prepared to navigate this area in practice. We realised that to equip doctors to practice effectively across cultures, we needed to investigate areas such as communication skills, where aptitudes and practice are culturally determined. And for this, we'd need qualitative research for a deeper understanding and practical toolkits and solutions. So I'll go on to show how we took on those challenges. The qualitative research looked into lived experience of this cultural dilemma. And we chose phenomenology to look deeply into what clinicians were thinking, feeling when they faced this problem, with a view to informing educational interventions. So within the methodology of phenomenology, we used sampling, purposive sampling. So firstly, we looked at medical students, so Newcastle University, Malaysia and the UK. They took part in focus group interviews that were semi-structured. And then data interpretation was by me, Sophie Holmes, and it was using a phenomenological lens. The other cohort was international medical graduates working in the northeast of England. And they took part in telephone interviews, which were up to 60 minutes and semi-structured. They had lots to say. And the reflexive statement to take into account looking at my interpretation of the data is that I'm a UK trained clinician, so I come with an inherent bias towards Western values and preferences. I worked in Malaysia, which gave me more insight into different cultures, and I have extra cultural heritage. So in my family, I've got influence from the UK, but also Sri Lanka. Medical students in the UK and Malaysia, 26 took part. Their experience was starkly marked by suffering. So they experienced facing this dilemma, moral discomfort, a dilemma, and a sense of powerlessness. Their sympathetic distress on behalf of the patient was marked. They'd really witnessed the disadvantages of trying to hide a diagnosis. Diagnoses were revealed under suboptimal circumstances with an adverse impact on the patient. For example, one student was on a ward round and was translating for the patient, and the doctor said, "We're going to do surgery for this patient tomorrow. Can you tell her that we're going to do surgery? Is she okay with that? We're going to put in a stoma." And so she said, so I was like, "We're going to do surgery tomorrow and we're going to put in a stoma." And the patient was like, "Why?" And so I said, "She's asking why, doctor. She didn't know she had cancer." The patient was so confused. That was really bad, this situation. In addition to seeing the practical impact, the idea of hiding information went against their moral principles of patient autonomy, and they felt they themselves would be unhappy if something was happening to them without them knowing, and informed consent. And so one UK student went as far as to say, "It's your worst fears about medicine." However, in spite of this really stark preference for open communication with patients at both sites, in Malaysia, the students faced a dilemma. They still felt that there was a potential for harm with frank communication, and that patients were going to be psychologically distressed if they knew what was happening. In part, they explained this due to differences in the patient group. Patients in Malaysia, they said, were less well educated, they were more emotionally affected by news, and that there were cultural perceptions of cancer that made it a taboo. And this then led them to have a dilemma between their personal and professional lives. One student said, "If I was in the family's shoes, I would choose collusion. But if I was in the doctor's shoes, obviously I would want to tell the patient." This dilemma was rooted in cultural differences. There are several cultural differences that have been described or sort of aligned with healthcare. For example, the differences in power dynamics, the focus on tasks or people, but the real one at play here, most at play, is collectivism versus individualism. In a Malaysian context, families are much closer, and they tend to provide the bulk of patient care, and challenging this sort of approach and challenging the family's preferences led to a loss of cultural sovereignty. As one student said, "If the patient is someone I love or I care about, it is quite hard to disclose the diagnosis because I'm from here, born here, brought up here. My education is education, but this is who I am deep inside." Even when students wanted to communicate openly with patients, there were many barriers. Clinical workload was a big one. As they described, in government settings, you can have 150 patients to see in a day or twice a day, which shouldn't compromise care, but they recognised the limitations. And they noted that their training was not aligned fully with their context, that they were just going to have to adapt when they were junior doctors. When they reached a certain level, they might be able to change the culture, but the reality was they would not be able to act out on their principles when they were junior. International medical graduates, our participants were from a range of countries, levels of seniority and specialties, including clinical haematology, general surgery and clinical haematology. We had 16 participants, and again, the same three themes emerged when they faced requests to hide diagnoses, and these were moral discomfort, dilemma, and powerlessness. Again, their discomfort was marked. They had seen firsthand the dangers of hiding diagnoses, with bad news being broken at night, and they had one of them even had a desire to go back and change practice. This was a consultant from Turkey. He said, you come to a point where you actually dismiss the previous practice. Sometimes I want to go back and train some people, but even if you trained your doctors, the public is not ready. It needs a radical change. It needs quite a number of years. They also experience the dilemma and its root of collectivism versus individualism. They recognised that in the settings where they trained, care was centred towards the family, and there was an essential collaborative relationship with patients' relatives. If they, as a clinician, go against what the patient's relatives want, there's a real danger. And they said there's nothing like, I'm going to speak to the patient, please come out. That's an insult. You are creating a problem between you as a person who treats that patient and the family member who is going to be looking after him on a daily basis. There is going to be a lot of unhappiness around. They went even further, beginning to challenge how we approach care in the West, and said there are real dangers of transposing practices across cultures. UK society is very individualistic and very autonomous. People live on their own. You don't know how much support the family will give. The son or daughter will not see the family member from Christmas to Christmas. You cannot say, I'm going to tell the patient, but I'm sure they'll be looking after him, because they will not be there for him. So each approach is serving the society that you're in the best possible way, and you cannot apply one situation to the other. And this is not only an expression of the dangers of transposing cultures, it is a frank expression of a preference for non-Western values and an admission that there is a sense of community that we have lost. The clinicians were vividly aware of the barriers to frank communication in the context where they initially trained or started working. They recognised there was a lack of diagnostic information, and so in a situation where you're seeing a huge number of patients, very low resources, they may not have much in terms of a real diagnosis to give. They had a very basic infrastructure. It was much more about simple management, things like sepsis. It would be difficult to explain what's going on. You would just tell the patients' families that they were unwell in the absence of access to imaging or further diagnostics. And then once a diagnosis was made, there was a real lack of resources to support and treat, minimal palliative care, minimal social support. Sadly, a number of clinicians reported feeling intimidated into this practice. This could take the form of coercion from the patients' families or even physical intimidation. Several of them reported this experience where you just hide the information, it's like hide and seek, it's scary, relatives will be quite volatile, some of the doctors verbally, sometimes physically, and the doctors are intimidated by their attitude. Clinicians also felt they were underprepared for the problem. There was either a lack of communication training or it was inappropriate, and the practice of concealing diagnoses had become an unwritten rule. For example, one participant voiced that the literature they used isn't based on Egyptian patients, it's from the UK or it's from the US. So even though we learn the theory, it's practically useless because we're not dealing with the same type of patients. And so we've got these three main themes that emerge. The moral discomfort leading to a sense of regret and a moral injury has been discussed in similar qualitative studies. And what we really added was that going against principles that our participants voiced. Sense of dilemma, so that tug of war between collectivism and individualism is key in this dilemma. We need to recognise that the individualism in the West is unusual, and with it, it brings a huge values complex. It brings emphasis on autonomy, self-determination, patient-centred care, informed consent, confidentiality. And those all, as a UK-trained clinician, sound really excellent sort of professionalism. However, we need to recognise that this is not universal and that patients in the West fear dependence on other people over death. And that is unusual, and that is extreme. And we really need to acknowledge that that is a difference between Western culture and other ways of viewing ourselves, and that through this increase in individualism, there has been a loss of personal value and belonging. A really moving piece of anthropological research interviewed patients in Tamil Nadu about their situation, and a common story was that a patient would say, I know that I have cancer, I think I have cancer, but my family haven't told me because they love me, and my doctors haven't told me because they're professional. And so that act of hiding the diagnosis, while it does lots of harm, can be seen as a symbol of love. And finally, the powerlessness. This needs to be recognised. There aren't simple solutions here. Clinical workload hugely limits the ability to take time to communicate. The risk of intimidation shows that it's no surprise that clinicians will choose the path of least resistance for their physical safety. And we need to acknowledge that these sorts of disavowed factors have an influence when we tackle professional dilemmas. What are the implications? How can we move forward from these? So for each of these three themes, there are particular ways that medical education can help. So firstly, for the moral dilemma, acknowledge the phenomenon, acknowledge its significant emotional impact, and in training for people moving across cultures, really recognise that this is going to be hard for them, and they're likely to bring with them misperceptions and fears that need to be realigned while valuing the culture that they bring. Through this process, we need to centre cultural humility and decolonisation. The West has biases. Our emphasis on individualism over relationships is unusual. And there are other ways of understanding ethics, such as Confucianism or Ubuntu, which look much more at our humanity in our connection to other people. While I would not support hiding diagnoses from patients, I think that exploring these underpinnings does begin to show us what Western culture has lost. And these sorts of preferences do shape how medical students tackle ethical dilemmas. When medical students on elective from the Middle East and Canada tackled ethical dilemmas with Canadian medical students, they had very different approaches to problems. And we need to recognise and celebrate these differences and see what both cultures can learn. And finally, we need practical communication tools. There are kind of longer term problems like increasing public awareness of the issue, providing legislation, professional guidelines that support frank communication. But the low-hanging fruit is to have training in conflict resolution so that clinicians feel equipped for this conversation with families. And that's where our model Arches comes in. We published the model in BMJ Supportive and Palliative Care in 2021. This is a copy of the paper. You may be familiar with SPIKES, which is a framework for breaking bad news to patients. To align with that, the framework that we've developed is called Arches. The key message here is that Arches is only to be used in a very specific scenario, and that is when a family speaks to the clinician before the patient and says, don't tell them. I think they've got cancer, don't tell them. And it's how you then handle that situation, because you've got a few challenges in that interaction. You need to preserve the patient's confidentiality. You need to find out what the patient wants before moving forward with any kind of breaking bad news process, but you need to build relationship with the family, and you need to create a rapport that means you're going to move forward collaborating with them. And so that's what this Arches framework allows you to do. We'd be really keen to see this tested, and in particular for it to be adapted and changed to suit particular cultural contexts, because as cannot be stated enough, key here is cultural humility. In summary, when a cancer diagnosis is made, it is in everyone's interest that the patient hears the diagnosis, least of all the patient themselves. Of course, there is an exception. If the patient doesn't want to hear the diagnosis, chooses not to, then absolutely they can be spared from that. What are the barriers that we need to overcome? So first of all, there's the inner dilemma. And so the first step is to get the clinicians on board. So educate doctors on the benefits of frank communication, reassure them that their fears around the harm of diagnostic disclosure are unfounded, and that their deeper cultural values will be respected and will be retained. And secondly, there's the barriers external to the clinician. There's lots of external coercion and a lack of preparation. And so, yes, the need here is to educate the public, provide legislation and guidance, and provide communication tools which maintain relationships while upholding the patient's right to knowledge and promote cultural humility. Feel free to email me any questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Really, really interesting presentation. Do we have some questions from our audience today? There's quite a few people I know are very interested in this area. I've just emailed one or two who it seems that unfortunately weren't able to make it. But I think, you know, for our own students,